Welcome to On Contact. Today, in a two-part discussion, we speak with Professor David Harvey about his new book, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles.
When capitalists make a product and they sell it in the market, how long does that product stay in the market and how long do we keep it? I like to use the example, I still use my grandparents' knives and forks, which were made in Sheffield in 1890 or something like that. Now, if capital made things that lasted that long, then it would have been in a lot of trouble. So it's made things that last shorter and shorter periods, partly through technological obsolescence. I mean, how many forms of iPhones have you been through? How many computer systems and so on? So there's been an acceleration, if you like, of the turnover in which we consume things. But then what's happened is that since the 1970s, there's been an increasing kind of problem of the consumers get sort of, I mean, how much can you stack in your house in terms of consumer durables? How many refrigerators can you have? And so on. So capital started to sell something which was totally ephemeral, which is experiences.
David Harvey, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, is a leading theorist in the field of urban studies. Library Journal calls Professor Harvey, quote, one of the most influential geographers of the later 20th century. Professor Harvey earned his PhD from Cambridge University and was formerly a professor of geography at Johns Hopkins, a Miliband Fellow at the London School of Economics, and Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford. He is a prolific author, including his books Rebel Cities, From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution, A Companion to Marxist Capital, Social Justice and the City, and his classic work, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. You can hear him on David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a bi-monthly podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. He also gives a series of lectures called Reading Marx's Capital with David Harvey on his website, davidharvey.org, which, if you have not read volumes 1 and 2 of Marx's Capital, is an invaluable way to match your reading with insightful commentary on this classic work. His latest book, which we will devote 2 shows to exploring, is The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. Joining me to discuss the reconfiguration of global capitalism, the contradictions of neoliberalism, the financialization of power, and the commodification of spectacle along with rate versus mass of surplus value and other issues fundamental to economic literacy in an age of globalization, is Professor David Harvey. So I'm a huge admirer of your book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. I think it's essential reading. But I would argue this book, too, is an extremely important work. And I want to begin, as you do at the start of the book, with how the landscape has changed. We don't have factories anymore. There are factories in China and Bangladesh, but this has had a major impact in terms of both how an economy is structured, but also how we resist.
Yes, indeed. It is a very different scene now. And I think we have to be good historical materialists and work with what actually exists rather than trying to interpret what exists through some ancient lens. We should adapt the lens to match the current situation.
Can you talk a little bit about what it means that labor has essentially been displaced from the industrialized world? This is true in the UK, it's true in the United States, it's true in many countries. What does that mean for the way the economy is structured? You talk about the drive towards financialization of the economy, and what does it mean for how labor begins to protect itself?
Well, one of the things I would start with is the importance of technological change. Every individual capitalist, in competition with others, is in a situation of trying to create a superior productivity of labor. And to the degree that they increase the productivity of labor, they need fewer laborers. So the ridiculous point would be where there's no labor employed at all, and everything else is done sort of automatically and through automation. So what we saw from the 1970s onwards, and this is very much about the neoliberal revolution, was the uh, attack upon manufacturing and the creation of a different kind of economy. For instance, I migrated to the city of Baltimore in 1969, and when I got there, there was a steelworks which employed over 30,000 people. By the time you get to 1990, it's employing 5,000, even though it's producing the same amount of steel. And now it's completely gone entirely. So the manufacturing base of many of the older cities like Detroit, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and so on has been attacked, but it's mainly through technological change. And that then leads the question of what happens to the working class and what happens to the working class organization. Again, when I moved to Baltimore, if you wanted to get something done, you went to the Steelworkers Union because they were very big and they're very powerful and they really had a lot of clout. But by the time you get to 1990, they've disappeared effectively as a political force. So labor is disempowered in manufacturing. Well, people have to be employed somewhere, so they go off and get employed in what we now call services and so on and the like. But the main point there is what Marx calls the coercive laws of competition force capitalists to adapt and adopt new technologies as fast as they can. And as they do so, they displace labor from productive activity. And so the working class in Cleveland or Baltimore or Philadelphia now looks radically, radically different from what it looked in, say, 1970.
Two issues. One, the refusal to raise the minimum wage, which you talk about in the book, and the whole rise of what we call the gig economy creates a kind of precariat situation among the working class that makes it difficult for them to organize, doesn't it?
Yes, and in effect, what happened in the 1970s was a frontal attack upon the power of workers and the working class organizations and institutions, which included, of course, the unions, but not only that, I think the working class base of the Democratic Party, or in Europe, it would be of communist parties and socialist parties. You know, this was a very powerful setup, and workers exercised a good deal of power. And the capitalist class and the corporate class decided, in effect, in the 1970s, that they were going to break that power. And in breaking it, they were going to reduce wages, because if you reduce wages, you get more profit. And the simple thing for them was to go after it. And of course, what Reagan did when he came into was to attack working class institutions with the attack upon the air traffic controllers and basically against all unions. So you get that sort of thing going on all over the world. Margaret Thatcher doing the same thing in Britain. So there's this sort of frontal attack upon labor. And that frontal attack is such that since 1970, it's been very, very difficult to see any advancement in wages, even though productivity has risen. Before 1970, there was a sharing of increases of the benefits of increasing productivity. The workers got some of it, capitalists got most of it, but at least workers got some of it. Since 1970, they've had none of it at all, and essentially the standard of living of the workers has been reduced very much, and the minimum wage has, if we had a 1960s minimum wage, we would have minimum wage now about $25 an hour. But right now we're nowhere near that, and it's even a big haul to get us to $15 an hour. So the condition of the working class has really been diminished, and its political power has been diminished by the loss of unionized, steady jobs. And the result of that is that workers have to get employed somewhere, somehow. So they either get into all sorts of shady activities of various kinds, or they go into services and they go into the gig economy and precarious labor and all the rest of it. Because again, capital likes to have precarious labor because then it doesn't have to pay pension fund money, it doesn't have to pay health care, it doesn't have to pay any of those things. So it sheds all those obligations and makes as much profit as it possibly can. So profit rates have been reasonably high, although for various reasons, since 1970, the aggregate profit rate has tended to fall. And I think that is a very significant feature of the global economy right now.
You write that this suppression of wages is by design, that there's a shift. You talk about how a few decades ago credit cards were almost unknown. But with the financialization of the economy, you needed to throw the working class or the mass of people within a country into debt peonage. Can you talk about that process?
I think if the working class is being diminished in its wages and the like, you're going to have a little bit of a problem with effective demand. I mean, if the market starts to shrink because wages are going down, then the problem arises: how are capitalists going to sell their goods when the working class is getting less and less money? Well, there are two answers to that. The one answer is, well, the working people can buy on credit. And this has been hugely important in terms of what we call consumer durables. You know, refrigerators and cars and houses, they're all bought on credit. And workers get more and more heavily indebted in order to do that. But the other thing you can do is that even though the working wage is going down, if there are more workers employed, then that increases the market, even though they're employed at lower wages. So that to some degree, the effective demand problem, which arose with the reduction of consumerism with the working class, is solved partly by this move into the credit system, and so everybody's purchasing things on the never never, or that more people are employed. And globally, there's been a huge increase in the wage labor force since 1970 or 1980.
Well, you also write about the expansion of consumer markets into China, Russia, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, as being important to global capitalism.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, we often think everything that bad happened to the workers in this country is because of offshoring and China's competition and all the rest of it. That had a fraction to do with it, but as I mentioned, technological change was far, far more important. But at the same time, the number of workers in the world has increased by 1 billion since 1970. And a lot of that is because China entered into the global system. Soviet Empire collapsed and all of Eastern Europe came into it. And again, there are other features like the reduction of peasant societies and the sort of their loss of livelihoods. And so they pour into the cities. So we get this massive urbanization. And that massive urbanization is a mass of workers waiting to be exploited and waiting to be employed if they possibly can. So there too, the market is increasing at the same time as the supply of labor is increasing on a global basis, simply by the expansion of the whole system.
Great. When we come back, we will continue our discussion about the reconfiguration of global capitalism and contradictions of neoliberalism with Professor David Harvey. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about the reconfiguration of global capitalism with Professor David Harvey. So I want to read a passage from your book. You write, "The neoliberal project has not come to an end. In fact, it has continued. But it has continued under a situation where it is no longer legitimate in the way that it was before. A new form of legitimacy had to be found for the neoliberal project. This new form of legitimacy is something which I think we have to pay very careful attention to. What is it? What are you saying about the loss of credibility and the new form of legitimacy?"
Yeah, when the neoliberal politics came into being, it was largely I regard it as a class project by the upper classes to try and enhance their wealth and power vis-a-vis everybody else. And as a result of that, the neoliberal period has been affected very deeply by great increases in inequality. I mean, the billionaires right now are all over the place, and they're increasing their wealth hand over fist, even in the midst of the pandemic. So that was one aspect of it, and in doing that, what the neoliberal project entailed was trying to get consent for a new kind of social order, one which was based on individual capacity, entrepreneurialism in the self, individual responsibility for healthcare, education, all those kinds of things. So this was the neoliberal package. And initially, when it came on, people consented to it because there was a widespread consent around Thatcher and Reagan because they were offering something rather different. But it was supposed to be to the benefit of all in the long run. But by the time you get into the end of the 1990s, it clearly is not for the benefit of the all. It's basically for the benefit of the corporations, the financiers, and the wealthy in society. And so the legitimacy of the project started to go down, and it really crashed in the crisis of 2007, 2008. But even during the 1990s, what you start to see is the legitimacy of the project starts to get eroded. And so you get an alliance emerging between the neoliberal kind of economic policies and the neoconservative authoritarian politics, which was typical of Dick Cheney and the neoconservatives of that time. So what you start to see is that the balance between what I would call coercion and consent starts to shift. That during the 1980s, there was a large wage of consent for the neoliberal project. That erodes, and that gets displaced by more and more coercion. And the coercion is a silent coercion, in part by the fact that a lot of the instruments of this transfer of wealth are in these institutions like the Federal Reserve. They're hidden from view. But then we start to go even more so. And I think what was so interesting about Trump is all over the place in lots of things, but his tax reform law was a classic piece of neoliberal engineering. It gave massive amounts of benefits to the big corporations and to the very ultra wealthy, and very small benefits to the mass of the population. So that politics continues, but it increasingly gets continued by this kind of very authoritarian politics, which has its roots back in the 1990s. And I think it's not sudden that we've suddenly become authoritarian. There was a creeping authoritarianism going on even during the Clinton years, and that authoritarianism was partly by the exercise of power by the bondholders. The famous statement by Clinton, saying, "I have my economic program rests entirely on the views of the bondholders," and I think it's symptomatic that the Secretary of the Treasury from about 1990 onwards has been in the hands of somebody who came from Goldman Sachs. So this is what I mean by the creeping form of authoritarianism. But then it became more overt after Trump gets elected, and of course globally what we see is authoritarian governments emerging all over the place. And I think for exactly the same reason, that the neoliberal project is not delivering the goods to the people. It's delivering the goods to big capital and to the very, very wealthy. And I think the mass of the population is less and less inclined to consent. It therefore has to be controlled through coercion.
One of the things you raise is the metrics by which we measure not only economic health, but you even argue the global crisis that we face in terms of climate change. So can you just speak about this conflict of rate versus mass, of supply value? I think it's a Marxian term, but I thought it was very interesting.
Well, the simple question you would ask, I would ask of anybody is, would you prefer to be sitting there with $100 and a 10% rate of return, or $1 million and a 2% rate of return? Which would you prefer? And you can see immediately that even though the rate is very low, for the person who has millions and millions of dollars, that's still a huge increase in their absolute wealth. whereas somebody who has almost no money whatsoever can have a 10% increase and it's worth nothing. So I think that this question of do you start to talk about well-being in terms of the rate, or do you talk about it as the rate in the context of the mass? And a lot of thinking in economics and elsewhere is constantly going on about, well, we have to grow at 3%, or so it's all about rates, not thinking about the mass. But when you have a huge mass, a very low rate is still creating more and more problems. I mean, climate change is a very good example of that. If climate change is a result of the expansion of human activities, then one of the things that is important is the mass of the economy now is, even with a 2% rate of growth, that's a huge, huge massive increase in output and also in extraction of resources and all the rest of it. And so the climate change starts to become more and more of a problem because of the mass rather than because of the rate. Now, obviously, rates and masses are part of the same story, but the thing that strikes me is that it's often convenient for economists and politicians and all the rest of it to talk about the rate, because it disguises the fact that even with low rates, the very ultra rich can expand immensely. For instance, Elon Musk during this year went from something like 25 billion in terms of his assets to 150 billion or 125 billion or whatever it was. I mean, an enormous increase in the mass. Now, in that case, he had a fairly good rate. But the point here is that when people have a tremendous amount of assets, then a very small rate is going to give them a great deal of extra leverage and purchasing power in society, compared to, say, somebody who has almost no assets whatsoever and who has a high rate of growth. But it will get them a few extra cups of coffee, as opposed to, for the very rich person, even a 1 or 2% rate of growth can actually lead them able to buy out corporations or buy out media outlets and the like.
Well, it also perpetuates this lie among mainstream economists that the poorer segments, not the 1%, but the rest of us, are doing really well because
Yes.
the rate is higher on what you call very marginal income.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the way in which economists disguise the effects of what they're writing about always amazes me, and I wanted people to become alert about this, and just to be able to parse the language that comes down and says, oh, the growth rate last year was very good. You increased your wages by 30% or something like that. Well, 30% of nothing is basically nothing. So this is the point of why it's very important for people to look when people start talking about rates and to ask the question, what mass are we talking about that rate affects?
I want to talk about the expansion of money in the global marketplace. You write global GDP is close to 80 trillion. We now need to find new investment opportunities for an extra 80 trillion, hopefully yielding at least 3% profit over the next 25 years. This is what capitalists seek. And you write about the commodification of spectacle, paying money, getting consumers to pay for things that are ephemeral. I thought that was a really interesting point, and maybe you can close by speaking about that.
I think, to me, this is one of the things that is really very, very, very significant. When capitalists make a product and they sell it in the market, how long does that product stay in the market, and how long do we keep it? I like to use the example, I still use my grandparents' knives and forks, which were made in Sheffield in 1890 or something like that. Now, if capital made things that lasted that long, then it would have been in a lot of trouble. So it's made things that last shorter and shorter periods, partly through technological obsolescence. I mean, how many forms of iPhones have you been through? How many computer systems and so on? So there's been an acceleration, if you like, of the turnover in which we consume things. But then what's happened is that since the 1970s, there's been an increasing kind of problem of the consumers get sort of, I mean, how much can you stack in your house in terms of consumer durables? How many refrigerators can you have, and so on. So capital started to sell something which was totally ephemeral, which is experiences. And I would take, it started to capitalize and monetize. Or, for instance, sporting, so that the NFL and basketball and the soccer leagues and so on now become big capital because they're selling spectacle. And the spectacle is over, it's immediately over, and then you go on to the next one. And so the spectacle economy and selling of experience starts to be a very, very significant aspect of the economy. But a huge amount of fixed assets need to go into supporting that. So that, take the other issue, the expansion of tourism. The tourism expanded enormously after 2007, 2008. It was one of the vehicles whereby capital started to, find selling the experience of tourism. But to have a tourist industry, you need the hotels, you need the airlines, you need the airports, you need the restaurants, you need a vast amount of fixed capital. So a huge amount of capital goes into supporting this ephemeral experience. And that has a tremendous cultural effect. Everything becomes short-term. Everything is short-termism.
Great. Welcome to On Contact. Today is the second part of our discussion with Professor David Harvey about his book, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles.
How often do you hear this all set up in a way which blames capital for the problems? And the answer is very rarely. It's always these other things. And that's one of the reasons I think that the analysis from a Marxist perspective that is likely to light on capital as being the source of the problem is again rejected and pushed out of view. So this is kind of one of the forms of social control which exists right now, which where the ability to say, well, that the heart of the problem lies in the dynamics of a capitalist mode of production, which is producing huge problems right now in terms of things like climate change and social inequality.
In our previous show, we discussed central themes raised in the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles by Professor David Harvey, who is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Library Journal calls Professor Harvey, quote, one of the most influential geographers of the later 20th century. Professor Harvey earned his PhD from Cambridge University and was formerly Professor of Geography at Johns Hopkins, a Miliband Fellow at London School of Economics, and Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford. You can hear him on David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a bi-monthly podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. He also gives a series of lectures called Reading Marx's Capital with David Harvey on his website, davidharvey.org, which, if you have not read volumes 1 and 2 of Marx's Capital, is an invaluable way to match your reading with insightful commentary on this classic work. We will focus this show on the social, political, and economic consequences of neoliberalism and globalization, exploring alienation, the rise of authoritarianism, the significance of China in the world economy, the geopolitics of capitalism, carbon dioxide emissions and climate change, as well as our collective response. Joining me to discuss these issues is Professor David Harvey, author of The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. So, David, let's begin with alienation, which you see as a consequence of neoliberal policies with, of course, deep cultural, social, and political ramifications.
I think the question of alienation is something that we ought to pay great attention to. One of the things that's happened in the labor processes is that increasingly workers themselves don't have very much control over what they're producing and why they're producing it and how it is being produced. And as a result of that, Labour from the very beginning tends to be what we call alienated labour. That is, they have a capacity to labour, a capacity to think, but those capacities are actually pushed to one side, and they're turned into sort of machine minders and all the rest of it. And so you get this notion of alienation in the labour process. And I think that when you start to ask questions of people, are you happy in your work? Is it satisfying? Do you find it meaningful? And the answers are that more and more work has become sort of just bullshit jobs in a way, and as a result of that, there's very little satisfaction. I mean, I personally get satisfaction out of the work I do, but I'm in a very privileged situation. And one of the things that's interesting about right now is there's signs in the United States that everybody thought everybody that would rush back into work when the pandemic was over, but the labour market is suggesting people are not. And when people start to say, well, why not? The answer often comes back, it's badly paid, and why should I go back to that? It's unsatisfying, why should I go back to that? So that there's a sense in which alienation in the labour process is starting to become a topic even amongst the workers themselves, and they're looking for more satisfying, better paying jobs, and they're not going to come back into the labour force until they can get them. So there's alienation in the labour process. Then there are all these kind of problems of alienation in daily life, and the difficulty of getting decent treatment out with COVID and all those kinds of things, and getting access to services and so on, and the bureaucracies which exist, and the intimidations that exist. So people are alienated from the institutions which really should be supporting them. And of course, increasingly, they're alienated by politics, because politics is essentially a game played right now by various wings of the bourgeoisie, various wings of the upper classes, who are, through their donations, big money is basically controlling the politics of both the Republicans and the Democrats. And so there's a kind of feeling of, this political system is not working for me. This economic system is not working for me. So I'm just going to be turned off. And that's a big sign of alienation, is being turned off until such point as something comes along and people get really angry. So the typical response of an alienated population is to sort of be rather passive and aggressive in its posture towards what's going on. Something happens, like, I don't know, somebody gets killed by the police in London or somewhere, and then suddenly the whole place blows up because people are so alienated. So I think that the question of alienation is significant, and it says something politically. Politically, we want to have a system that meets people's needs democratically, and we have a huge democratic deficit to make up. And secondly, we need to have an economy that actually produces things that are valuable to us in such a way as to make our lives easier and better, rather than more and more complicated.
Is this the reason they've cut back on the expansion of unemployment benefits? They do extend the moratorium on foreclosures and evictions by a few months. That's going to run out eventually. Isn't this a way to put pressure on a reluctant working class to go back to these jobs?
Oh, I think there's a great pressure to do that, but there's also right now great resistance. I mean, I unfortunately, being on lockdown, I can't get out there and talk to a lot of people, but just listening to some interviews on the radio, listening and reading some stuff, a lot of people are saying, I'm not yet ready to go back to work. Yes, I've been out of work now for almost a year. And why should I change? So, and particularly if the benefits are reasonably good. And of course, the Republican point is to say, well, if you're paying out good, generous unemployment benefits, then you diminish the incentive for people to rejoin the labor force at low wages and under miserable conditions. But there's a big contest going on right now over that issue, and the anticipation, which was, as soon as the COVID thing relaxed a bit, there will be a huge rush back into the labor force. It's not happening, and I think this is a sign of the fact that people see that What's waiting them in that labour force are alienated positions, low wages, unsatisfying life. And a lot of people are beginning to say, no, we want something different. We need something. This is therefore a very good point where there can be some good left organising around exactly these kinds of questions, wages and conditions of labour.
You write in your chapter on alienation, you call it a double alienation. You say it's foundational for what the capitalist mode of production is all about. What do you mean by double alienation?
Well, you know, we often think that the entrepreneur is free to do what the entrepreneur wants. But in fact, the coercive laws of competition are such that even the capitalist is not free. The capitalists have developed a system in which the financial flows and credit and all the rest of it, the capitalists are actually as imprisoned within the system as the workers are. The only difference is, of course, that the capitalists, by and large, not always, but by and large, have a much better lifestyle because they have a lot more money. But they are not free to choose. I mean, Milton Friedman's famous argument that capitalism is about freedom to choose. The capitalist is not free to choose. If the capitalist is faced with competition from, I don't know, China or Bangladesh or Mexico or something like that, then the capitalist goes out of business. So, and if the capitalist wants to pay a generous wage and everybody else is paying measly wages, and a good capitalist has to pay measly wages because that's the only way which they can stay in business. So when I say it's doubly alienated, the worker is alienated because they're having all of the richness of their possible capacity to labor taken away and destroyed. But the capitalist also likes to think that they are in command and they're in control and all the rest of it. But a lot of the time, the system is in charge of them. And I think it's this systemic problem which is at the root of a lot of what we now think of as alienation. So you will find capitalists who are alienated. I mean, I've talked to some financiers who kind of look at the situation and say, well, you know, I can make a lot of money by doing some fairly crooked things. I don't like doing it, but all the time it's this way, I'm going to do it. But this is not a good life, and I don't like this good life.
Well, this is what Marx understood. Whatever the fear, the capitalist fear of labor, what truly frightens a capitalist or other capitalists.
Yes, exactly.
I want you to talk about compensatory consumerism. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, the worker goes to the work, and let's suppose it's very alienating labor. And I'm very unhappy, but the worker says, okay, as long as you give me a wage that allows me to go into the consumer markets and, you know, have some consumer power so that I can, I don't know, buy a bicycle or, you know, do something that's good for me. And so, in a sense, capital often offers this, this a Faustian bargain. Says, okay, put up with lousy work conditions, but then enjoy yourself when you get into the market because you've got all of these commodities there. You go into the supermarket or you go into the store, and if you have enough money, you're going to really, really relax. So that people don't rebel against the conditions in the labor because they are compensated by consumer choices, which are supposed to be good. Now, a lot of the time, of course, consumer choices are not that good and turn out to be a bit of a fraud. So again, the consent is likely to break down. But there have been, I think, phases in the history of capitalism where compensatory consumerism has worked fairly well. I think that some ways for certain segments of the population in the United States in the 1960s, compensatory consumerism said, okay, you go to work and you've got a union job and all the rest of it, and you're being exploited, but enjoy it because at least you have a car in the driveway and you've got a TV and you've got all of those kinds of things.
Well, you also argue in the book that there was a kind of Faustian bargain between capital and the left. So if you want to express yourself individually as a gay man or that these kind of individual rights were incorporated, but you can't touch the system
Yes.
of corporate capitalism itself. And I think that's a very good point. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about the geopolitics of capitalism with Professor David Harvey.
corporate parasites in power today might think their control will continue forever. Whether they're right or wrong, we have to keep fighting. Question more.
Mark Twain said it's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. That could be why America is so divided now, because people have been fed fake news paid for by corporate interests. They beat you down until you believe their fairy tales. Well, here's a story for you. It's called The Big Picture, and it's full of facts, not fiction. Question more.
Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our discussion about the geopolitics of capitalism with Professor David Harvey. You write about the political consequences of alienated populations. You say they're vulnerable and open to sudden and unpredictable mobilizations, that there becomes a question of who is to blame for the malaise. Capital, which controls the ruling ideas over the mass media, ensures that capital itself is the least to be blamed, and then you find scapegoats: immigrants, lazy people, people not like me or you, people who offend the moral code, people who do not share my religious views or something of that kind. And that leads to political instability, which I think we're already seeing, and violent confrontations, you write, and that this is now, as capital continues this kind of assault, this political turmoil becomes the norm.
Oh, absolutely, and I think all around the world we see that happening. But my question to really the whole audience is that how often do you hear this all set up in a way which blames capital for the problems? And the answer is very rarely. It's always these other things. And that's one of the reasons I think that the analysis from a Marxist perspective that is likely to light on capital as being the source of the problem is again rejected and pushed out of view. So this is kind of one of the forms of social control which exists right now, which where the ability to say, well, the heart of the problem lies in the dynamics of a capitalist mode of production, which is producing huge problems right now in terms of things like climate change and social inequality and the like, and an absorption of the mass of product which is now being created. And this is the heart of the problem that we should be looking about. Now, I'm not sort of saying we have to overthrow this system overnight, but I say we have to look at the heart of the problem, and at the center of the problem lies this question of what is capital and how is capital working, and why is it that the capitalist system, which is so dynamic, is so ineffective in meeting the mass needs of the mass of the population.
I want to talk about fictitious capital. This is again a term from Marx, and the dispute with China. You argue in the book that as long as China was producing products where people were paid low wages, China was palatable. But China has gone into the financialization of the global economy in a way that now poses a threat. But explain that idea.
Well, it's not. Well, while there is a financialization aspect to it, I think that China basically played this key role in global capitalism as a low-wage economy. And in some ways, this benefited, for example, the US working class, because consumer products became much cheaper because they were made in China. So the fact that the Chinese were doing that was very significant. But then the Chinese started to say, look, being a low-wage economy is not means you don't really have power. I mean, we're like Bangladesh and the rest of it. So what we have to do is we have to start to move into a capital-intensive economy. So China starts to move into electronics, and it starts to move into artificial intelligence and things of that kind. So China is now one of the centers of the high-tech revolution which is going on. And to the degree that China is doing that, it is changing the whole kind of global dynamic. Now, the US has held its position in the global economy by its technological advantage. China now is drawing close to the United States, and in some areas is plainly ahead of the United States in terms of artificial intelligence. And that is bothering everybody in the United States. So the United States is trying to hold back China from becoming a high-tech economy, and by exercising stuff about intellectual property rights and the like. But frankly, I don't think that the United States is in a position to be able to stop it. And China says it's going to become a high-tech economy by 2025, and that's 4 years away. And they're moving very, very fast. And what happens in China is, it looks like this in 2010, and then it looks like something radically different by the time you get to 2015. So China is very heavily being transformed, and over the last several months, major transformations have started to occur in China, where China started to say it is going to take care of social inequality, because China became a very unequal society. Now China is now saying it's going to take care of it. It says it's going to take care of problems of housing, healthcare, and education. And when the Chinese say they're going to do things, they tend to do things. And so we're seeing a kind of a rather centralized, authoritarian kind of lineup, but nevertheless aimed towards revolutionizing the internal economy, but also revolutionizing external relations. And there's no question that the Chinese at some point or other are going to start to challenge the United States' power in the world by replacing the dollar diplomacy that the US exercises by Chinese RMB currency. So China, I think, has ambitions to be a provider of the global currency. So yes, indeed, there's a whole set of issues there in terms of the dynamism of what's going on in China, and the threat it poses to US hegemony, both technologically but also financially.
You write at one point in the book that these kinds of tensions led to 2 world wars, that you think the consequences of this financial clash can be catastrophic. Can you explain why?
Yeah, well, as we know, a country which is clearly threatened by another country will probably find all kinds of means to resist it, both internationally and through international institutions and the like, and at a certain point is likely to engage in some sort of activities which could lead into war. Of course, since 1945, the idea of an all-out nuclear war is terrifying enough to, I think, everybody on all sides that we're unlikely to see something of that kind. But what we're likely to see are limited conflicts of various kinds. But again, some of the techniques of conflict these days, and this is where the artificial intelligence is coming in, some of the techniques of conflict these days are shifting from the sort of traditional armaments sector to things like artificial intelligence and superiority of communications networks and things of that kind. So this is a very transformational moment in the world economy. And I think everybody should be sort of thinking about this and worrying about this, because any sort of major clash between great powers right now is likely to be absolutely terrifying in terms of its consequences.
Well, all of the monarchies and governments that led to the suicidal folly of World War I had no idea what they were unleashing.
Right.
Under inept leadership, things can rapidly become a kind of death spiral. I want to speak just to close about the climate crisis, because you write about it, and then what our collective response should be.
Yeah, I mean, when Marx was writing, capital occupied, it was well established in Britain. There were elements of it in Europe and on the eastern seaboard of the United States, but the rest of the world was non-capitalist. And Marx is writing a theory of capital and is explaining why it's going to grow and why the world market is going to come about and why it's going to become a global phenomena. And he was very appreciative about that, but we've now got there. And right now we kind of say, where do we expand? When Marx was writing, there are plenty of places to expand. I mean, plenty of empty continents and things like that, and even occupied continents which didn't have a capitalist form of organization. But now you're looking at everything that's going on in China, a lot of what's going on in India and Indonesia and Latin America. And in other words, capital has become global. And you mentioned, the size of the economy now is something like $80 trillion. Well, in 1950, it was about $4 trillion. So it's gone to $80 trillion. And if you double every 25 years, you're going to have another. And it comes back again to this rate and the mass. The mass of carbon emissions right now is becoming a real problem. And the mass that's already there is a real problem because it dissipates very slowly. And the figure that stands out in my mind is that NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they did a timeline of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over 800,000 years. And they can do this sort of thing now. And they showed that there were never concentrations of above 300 parts per million until 1960, when it went above 300 parts per million. It is now at something like 427 parts per million. In other words, the mass of greenhouse gas is already in the atmosphere. If you emitted nothing at all for the next 25 years, you would still see massive melt of the Greenland ice cap and Antarctica and all the rest of it. So we've got a real serious mass problem on our hands. And I go back to that idea how important it is to look at the mass. The mass, when Marx was writing, was minimal. So you could have a high rate and it didn't really matter that much. We've now got to a point where the mass is such that even a low rate of carbon emissions is going to add to that mass so massively that we're going to have real serious problems. And now we're beginning to see it. I mean, just in this year, we've had all the fires in Australia, Western United States, Greece, and we've had the climate things and so on. And for even worse than that, at the lower level, I think that things like the virus, I think the production of viruses is much more likely in high-density populations and expanding ecosystems which are industrialized. So I think there are all sorts of issues of that kind which need to be looked at very carefully, and we simply cannot expand even at a 2 or 3% rate of growth. We have to start to bring it down, and we have to find some way, if we possibly can, of extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are some techniques which are around, none of which are, I think, at this point, very effective.
Great. We're going to have to stop there, David. You'll have to read the book. He ends the book with our collective response, which can be summed up as smash global capitalism and create something else.
It's anti-capitalist.
That was author.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
Okay,
that was author and Professor David Harvey on his new book, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.